is going on, guys? My name is Aaron, and this is the Game Day Hour. Welcome back to another episode, and in today's episode, we're going to be doing the Fantasy Football Division review for the AFC West. That is the Los Angeles Chargers, that is the Las Vegas Raiders, the Denver Broncos, and the Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. We're going to be looking through 27 players, 7 from LA, 6 from Las Vegas, 7 from Denver, and 7 from Kansas City. And we're going to be seeing where they're going to be on my tier list based on what round I would draft them in personally. If you're wondering why this episode's coming out later than July 19th, it's because I got sick throughout that week and I was not able to record. My voice was very dry and very groggy, and I didn't want to record into that. But it's time to get into this episode. If you enjoy these, please be sure to subscribe. Let's get into the tier list. All right, we're in the tier list, and of course, we're starting with the Los Angeles Chargers. The Chargers, as a whole, got 722 fantasy points total among 7 players, and they had 45.13 points per week. That's 6.45 points per player for 7 players. Not very good. I think of 7.5 or 8 or more as a good team for fantasy. So the Chargers, they don't have a great track record right now, but their quarterback is one to behold for fantasy reasons. Justin Herbert had 3,134 passing yards, along with 23 touchdowns and 7 interceptions last year. That's 264 fantasy points, which was 17th among all quarterbacks. Here's the problem, though. He is dealing with the Josh Allen situation where he doesn't really have great receivers. Keenan Allen went to Chicago while Mike Williams went to the New York Jets. He's stuck with a wide receiver core which doesn't have a lot to prove, so it was very interesting why they didn't go after a wide receiver in the first round, but I guess it's time to see kind of why. I was confused by that. Herbert is still a rounds 3 through 5 kind of guy. I mean, he's been one of the best quarterbacks in the league for a while, and he's been on my 2 championship teams in 2020 when he was a rookie, and last year up until the playoffs. I'm very high on him, obviously, so I think others should be as well. After Justin Herbert, it kind of trickles down from there. Next up, we have Gus Edwards, and it's kind of funny. We have 2 Ravens running backs on the Chargers. And the first is Gus Edwards. Last year, he had 810 rushing yards and 13 touchdowns. That's 167 fantasy points, which was 14th among all running backs, which is very impressive. Gus Edwards has never been the number 1 running back. It's generally been J.K. Dobbins, but Dobbins has been hurt so much, so they have to give the nod to Gus Edwards. And Gus Edwards has a good track record of being very productive, despite, always being at the top of the free agency list. But I don't think we should sleep on Gus Edwards. I think he should be around round 6 through 9. I think he's really good as a running back. He's kind of better than Chuba Hubbard, and I kind of compare him to him because generally the backup to other running backs, but also is very good when he's on the field. As for J.K. Dobbins, I mean, the problem with Dobbins is clear. He is injury riddled. And last year, he only had 22 rushing yards and 1 touchdown due to injury, which was 9 fantasy points. Normally, I don't want to put an asterisk on injury this hard, but he gets injured so much that, to me, he's undraftable. And it's very bad because when he plays, he's good, but he's generally somewhere here when he plays. But being the backup right now and being injury riddled as he is, he's undrafted for right now. But I hope he can actually have a full season to prove himself. Next up, we have Joshua Palmer, who was the 3rd wide receiver last year. And as the 3rd wide receiver, he had 581 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns at 65 fantasy points. That was 64th among all wide receivers. Until I see more, he's going to have a lot to fill being the number 1 wide receiver. So undraftable is where I'd put him. He might be a high free agent. Who knows? But for now, I can't draft him because he hasn't proven a lot. And you can come back at me and say, well, you did it with the Bills wide receiver. And to that, I completely understand. But I also think Josh Allen's better than Justin Herbert and can get more production for his guys. I think that Justin Herbert, despite being really, really talented, I can't see these wide receivers being drafted, and that also goes for Quentin Johnston. Quentin Johnston had 431 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. That's 48 fantasy points. That was 80th among all receivers. And Johnston was the rookie last year, and he could come into his own to probably be the wide receiver 1. But until then, I have to have him as an undrafted player. You just have to prove a lot more. Next up, we have Will Dissly. Coming from the Seahawks, he had 172 receiving yards and only 1 touchdown. That's 18 fantasy points. That's 55th among all tight ends. Obviously, injury has something to play with it. Also, undraftable. We're on the slew here. There's not much to say about that. I mean, a lot of these tight ends, outside of 2 in this division, are just... they're not going to be drafted very often. And then lastly, we have the Chargers defense. Obviously, there's a lot of talent. And last year, they were 19th among all defenses with 151 fantasy points. So to me, they're a low draft pick. They have so many superstars. It's just their defense has faltered much, including the game where they gave up roughly 63 points to the Raiders. There's only 3 players I would draft from the Chargers. Herbert in the early rounds, 3 through 5. Gus Edwards towards the middle rounds, and the Chargers defense in the late rounds. But Palmer, Dobbins, Johnston, Dissly, I'm not going to pull the trigger on. Next up, the Las Vegas Raiders. As a whole, the Raiders had 675 total fantasy points, and among 5 players, that's 42.19 points per week. That's 8.44 per player. And that is very high for a team that I think is going to probably struggle this year as well. They lost a lot of pieces. They lost Derek Carr the year prior. Jimmy Garoppolo and Josh Jacobs are out. Now you have Aiden O'Connell as your quarterback. But will I say Aiden O'Connell was pretty impressive last year for literally having no hype behind him. He had 2,218 passing yards along with 13 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. That's 144 fantasy points, which was 28th among all quarterbacks. But 2 games that stood out for me, going to Arrowhead and winning, and of course the 63-point game against the Chargers. 4 touchdowns in that game, by the way. I don't think he's draftable just yet. There's just so many quarterbacks you can draft ahead of him, but I think that he's going to be a high free agent. As a matter of fact, I'd like to put him right up here. I just think that there's a chance he might be special this year. Like, very special. So, we'll see. Only time will tell. Next up, we have Zamir White. Zamir White had 451 rushing yards and a touchdown. 52 fantasy points. That was 57th among all running backs. Obviously, he was behind Josh Jacobs, so he didn't get a lot of time. He's unproven to me. So, again, that's another Raider going into the undraftable range. But with these 2 Raiders, there could be something special with them. You're just going to have to wait and see. Next up, we have Davante Adams. Davante Adams had 1,144 receiving yards. He also had 8 touchdowns. That's 155 fantasy points, which was 14th among all receivers. That's wide receiver 2 range. He's clearly somewhere up here. I'm going to say at the highest in round 2 is where he'd be drafted. And it's a little weird for me because most people would say 3 through 5, maybe even lower. But to me, Adams is still that guy that could be drafted in the first 2 rounds. So he's going to be there for now. I think that he has a lot to prove. And maybe Aiden O'Connell, if he lives up to what I think he could be, Adams could have a really good year. There's also rumors of Adams potentially leaving the Raiders, but that's not confirmed, obviously. But if he is a Raider, I'd still think 1 through 2. Even if he's not a Raider and he's still starting week 1, he's probably still rounds 1 through 2. Next up, we have Jacoby Myers. He had 807 receiving yards, 10 touchdowns, 141 fantasy points, which was 21st among all receivers. Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't Jacoby Myers the guy who was known for having a lot of yards for the Patriots but almost no touchdowns? Or was that somebody else? If it was somebody else, then this point can't be made. But if he is that guy, 10 touchdowns with the Raiders. That was more than Davante Adams. Jacoby Myers, I still have a little bit of skepticism, but he's a late draft pick. I mean, if he's getting into the end zone very often, then something's going right over there in Las Vegas, and I think he would be drafted in this range. It's funny, the quarterback's undrafted, but the 2 receivers are definitely draftable. Next up, we have Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers is coming from Georgia, the most hyped tight end since Kyle Pitts, and obviously you guys know how I feel about Kyle Pitts. I'm very crucial of him, so I should probably show that same energy to Brock Bowers, and I also think the Raiders shouldn't have gotten Brock Bowers, not because Bowers is bad, but because they don't need him. They had Michael Mayer. It just feels like a wasted draft pick. I think another team could have used Brock Bowers desperately more than the Raiders. But Brock Bowers last year for Georgia had 714 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns. Obviously, no fantasy points behind that. I think Brock Bowers is somebody who I would draft in the late rounds because I do think he's going to be great. I just think that the Raiders wasted a draft pick because they did not need Bowers. And Bowers could have strived somewhere better, but we'll see. I still think he is draftable, though. Lastly, we have the Raiders defense led by Max Crosby. Last year, they were 6th among all defenses with 183 fantasy points. I like where the Raiders defense is going. They made a lot of moves in free agencies, so I think that the Raiders should be right here, which basically is the end of our Raiders spree. With the 6 players we had, Adams goes in the first 2 rounds. Max Crosby and the Raiders are a middle draft team to pick up. And then 10 through 15, you got Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers, but undrafted is Aiden O'Connell and Zamir White. There's just a lot more they have to prove, but they could be high free agency picks. Now, with that said, we're going to move on to the Denver Broncos. The Broncos last year had 508 total fantasy points, and among 6 players, that's 31.75 per week. That's 5.29 per player. That is pretty bad, and it's 6 players even though we're looking at 7 because the first one we're looking at is their first round draft pick, Bo Nix. Now, I said in my short that I'm going to be grading Bo Nix and Jarrett Stidham based on if they were to be the full-time starter come week 1. And in my opinion, I think that Bo Nix should be the starter. So we're going to grade Bo Nix based on being the starter. And his time in Oregon last year was downright impressive. 4,508 passing yards along with 51 total touchdowns and only 3 interceptions. That's Heisman level statistics right there. But Jaden Daniels won because he also put up a monstrous year. Bo Nix, I think that if they start him, he will be somebody I would draft extremely late if I were going for that kind of fantasy strategy. I just think that he has so much promise to him. Problem is, does he have enough weapons around him? And if Jarrett Stidham was starting, which last year he put up 496 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, that's 28 fantasy points, which was 53rd. I think that Stidham is clearly somebody I would draft even if they were to go with him round 1. It's just he doesn't have a lot to prove. Bo Nix, there's a chance that Bo Nix could be something special. And because I think Bo Nix will get the starting nod, I'm going to be treating these players as what I think their production would be under Nix. So first off, we have Javonte Williams, 774 rushing yards, 228 receiving yards, and 5 total touchdowns. That's 122 fantasy points, which was 31st among all running backs. That's running back 3-4 range. He was my running back 4 on my championship team last year behind Isaiah Pacheco, Travis Etienne, and Breece Hall. And of course, he didn't have a lot of statistics in the year prior when I did this series for the first time. He has a better statistical matter for this year. I think he's somebody I would draft somewhere here. I think this is like a fair spot for him. I wouldn't draft him any higher nor lower. I think he's just going to be that middle running back. I think he'll have a better production, I think, this year if he stays healthy because the Broncos are going to need it. Courtland Sutton had 772 receiving yards and 10 touchdowns. That's 128 fantasy points, 28th among all wide receivers. What is it with Sutton not getting drafted? I mean, in all my fantasy drafts for the last 2 years, he has been a high free agent. I think that's wrong. I think he is somebody who should be drafted. As a matter of fact, don't underestimate. I think 6 through 9 is the best place you can have him. To me, Sutton definitely can be a highly productive wide receiver. Now that Jerry Jeudy is in Cleveland, he's back as the number 1. This was one of the best rookies in his rookie class. So just don't forget about that. Next up, we have Josh Reynolds, who was with Detroit last year. He had 608 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns. That's 84 fantasy points, 48th among all receivers. Again, it's going to be really hard to judge where you draft some of these players or where you wouldn't draft them because we don't know who the quarterback's going to be. If it's Bo Nix, I think he's going to get a lot of production, but for now, he'd be a high undrafted free agent. Next up, we have Adam Troutman, and last year had 204 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. That's 32 fantasy points, 37th among all tight ends. Somebody I would not draft. I have to see more, and tight end situation, again, this is like with Los Angeles. Not that impressive. So Troutman is going to end up here. So far, we have 3 Broncos. Ouch. And lastly, we have the Broncos defense. Really, with all these defenses in the AFC West, they're all draftable because this one was 16th, 158 fantasy points, 16th among all defenses. Patrick Surtain, I have a question. Would you rather have him or would you rather have Sauce Gardner? Think about that for a second. As for the Denver Broncos, I put the Broncos here, another high defense in the late rounds that I would draft. I think that they can be very, very good. If the Broncos offense can get going, this defense will have less pressure on it. They can be really good this year. But for now, I'll have them at 10 through 15. And that will wrap up all of our Broncos. Sutton and Javonte Williams are mid-round picks. Patrick Surtain in the defense, along with Bo Nix, if he is the starter, would get my nod for being drafted late. And then undrafted is Josh Reynolds, Troutman, and Stidham. Honestly, it was a little boring looking at those teams because they do not really compare, in contrast, to the Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. Looking at 6 players because one of them that we're going to be looking at today is, of course, a rookie. Of 6 players, they had 984 total fantasy points, 61.5 per week, 10.25 per player, the best in the AFC West. And there's no better place to start than with the best quarterback, without question, in the NFL, Patrick Mahomes, the 3-time Super Bowl champion. Mahomes, which he's now being brought into GOAT conversations for good reason. Last year was not a pretty year for him, not really because of him, but because, listen, there were so many drops last year. They had the worst receiving core, and they still won a Super Bowl, so take that to all the haters. Mahomes had 4,183 passing yards, along with 27 touchdowns and 14 interceptions. A lot of those interceptions were not his fault, though, and there were some that were definitely his fault. Mahomes, in a lot of leagues, he'll be drafted mostly in 3 through 5 in a lot of wide receiver, running back heavy drafts, but in normal drafts, I think 1 through 2 would probably be where he is. At the highest, a late first rounder. I just think that you cannot skip out on this kind of talent. Next up, we have Isaiah Pacheco. Patrick Mahomes was 8th last year with 324 fantasy points among all quarterbacks. Sorry. So that's quarterback 1 situation. Isaiah Pacheco was my running back towards the end of my year in a trade I got, and I gave away Jerome Ford and some others. I really liked the move, and Pacheco last year got me 935 rushing yards, 244 receiving yards, 9 touchdowns, 162 fantasy points. That's 16th among all running backs. Running backs are in high demand generally, and I see him being drafted at least somewhere in round 2. I think he just puts up that type of production, and Kansas City can't get it wrong. At times, they were trying to work with the 2 running back situation. Pacheco is easily their number 1. I don't think they need to look elsewhere. Next up, we have Rashee Rice. Now, big indicator for Rice, a lot of the offseason drama. You want to keep a look at that. Hopefully nothing else comes out about Rashee Rice, or else we might be looking at midseason suspensions, which that'll hurt his draft prospect. But let's say Rashee Rice does play the entire season. Last year, he had 938 receiving yards, which also had 7 touchdowns. It's 128 fantasy points, which was 27th among all receivers. Rashee Rice is somebody I would probably draft here in the mid-rounds. But again, be very, very cautious because of all the offseason drama. Next up, we have Marquise Hollywood Brown, and he coming over from the Arizona Cardinals. Didn't have a great year last year. He had only 574 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. That's 77 fantasy points, which is 52nd among all wide receivers. Again, he came from Arizona, but with that kind of production, he's going to be somewhere here being drafted very, very late, or most of the time I think he'd go undrafted. Or maybe people say he gets the starting nod, which I don't know if he will if Rashid Rice actually does play. But I think most cases he'll be undrafted. Next up, we have Xavier Worthy. Worthy is very well known right now for destroying the record for the 40-yard dash at the NFL Combine. Extremely impressive, and one of the more popular clips to come off of the NFL this offseason. Last year for Texas, he had 1,014 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns. This is, by the way, coming as the second wide receiver behind Adonai Mitchell. I still don't think he's going to be drafted just yet, but there's a chance this guy could become Patrick Mahomes, Tyreek Hill. There's a chance. That's all I'm saying. I think that it's very important to see how good this guy can be, because he could be the best wide receiver in this year's draft, and there's a lot of good wide receivers coming out of the draft. So we'll see. Next up, the GOAT tight end, Travis Kelce. I was about to make a Taylor Swift joke, but I completely lost it. I'm not going to go there. Of course, he was the talk of the NFL last year because of the whole Taylor Swift dating stuff. But last year he had 984 receiving yards along with 5 touchdowns. That's 120 fantasy points. Third among all tight ends. I'm pretty sure Sam Laporta and George Kittle were higher. We're not wasting time. We know Kittle is most of the time going to be in this round. In my draft, he was in the second round, which was a little surprising. I think here is a more reasonable spot because he is getting older. There is not a lot of years left for him. So I still think he's going to be one of the best tight ends. And he's so far, I think, my highest right here. Lastly, we have Chris Jones and the Chiefs defense, who played a pivotal role in that Super Bowl win. The Chiefs defense had 173 fantasy points, which was 12th among all defenses. So to me, they're up here. Actually, I would probably put the Raiders defense higher, but they're very impressive. They did lose L'Jarius Sneed, so there is that, but you gotta have them high up here. The Chiefs defense is going to be a force to be reckoned with next year. Now, let's take a look back. Pacheco and Mahomes are first 2-round type picks. Kelce is rounds 3 through 5. Rice and the defense, they're in 6 through 9, but undrafted we have Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy. Overall, if you look at this, most people are going to say the Chiefs. I mean, any NFL fan knows the Chiefs are probably in a very good spot to three-peat. So you have to look at them with high regards. And of course, 10.25 points per play, that's insane. So there's a lot of hope for the Kansas City Chiefs next year, of course. All these other teams, they have glimmers of hope, but we'll see. I don't think any team stacks up to Kansas City right now. Now it's time to get to our outro. Thank you guys for watching today's episode, and if you enjoy, please leave a like, comment down below, and subscribe. I know it should have came out last week. Again, got sick, and you could probably hear it in my voice. I'm still sick. Was able to get this one out, so thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to go follow me on all my social medias and interact with me on my social medias as well. Anyways, that'll do it for me. I hope you guys have a great day. Take care, and I'll see you all in the next one, which will be the last episode of the NFC West before we get into our regular season type content. Anyways, see you guys.